Hey, welcome to the Father Effect Show. It's John Finch, and today my guest is a good friend of mine named Scott Silverii. What's going on, brother?
Hey, brother, how you doing? It's so good to be here with you.
Dude, I have been looking forward to this, man. You've done a couple of different interviews for me and with me with some of the stuff we're doing, and now I get to hear your story, so I'm excited. Tell me, let's just dive right in. Tell me a little bit about like growing up. I know did you grow up in Louisiana?
Yeah, South Louisiana, down in the bayous, and a very different life than where I live now in Dallas. But yeah, again, I do. We've known each other for several years, and I was finally able to twist your arm to allow me to be on your show, and I
Oh,
appreciate it.
whatever. Whatever.
But no, I did. I grew up in deep South Louisiana, and I always tell people about an hour south of New Orleans, and everyone's usually shocked. They're like, "What is an hour south of New Orleans?" And it's Cajun country. It's the bayous and the swamps, and that's where I grew up. And what should really be a joyous environment, a very carefree sportsman's paradise, unfortunately wasn't for me growing up. And obviously it was because of a very dysfunctional life and a household dominated by my dad. That we had 7 kids, my mom and dad, and my dad really dominated our family. He was a big stud athlete, school teacher, high school ball coach, veteran. But his weapon was silence. Never, no, seldom laid a finger, but silence was the weapon. And we were not allowed to speak or express ourselves, or when we were physically hurt or emotionally hurt. And from his side, really my mom's, I mean, to never have been told that I like you, you're decent, hey, good job, I love you. And I never understood the effect, because it's your dad. You want to please him, then I started making excuses like, no, because all you know is what you know. So I'm living in this and it was a violent environment. I mean, just growing up. But when that's all you know, that's all you know. So you normalize that behavior. It doesn't mean it's normal, but it's your normal. And so I just started to make excuses for my dad, like things like, well, he's just a strong, silent type, and that's the way real men behave. And look, even till I was 50 years old, when he passed away, I was still sitting by his bedside, trying to almost trick him into saying something nice about me. And, with his last breaths, he took those words to the grave. He would not say, I love you or I like you. Silence reigned and ruined his entire life. And then, of course, it had a detrimental effect on mine as well.
Well, so to unpack a little bit of that, because I think there's a lot to that. In him being the silent type, in that maybe you only went to him if you really, really needed him, right? Did you transfer that to what your view of your Heavenly Father was like?
Yeah, big time. Actually, we never ever stepped foot in the church. Growing up, we tell people, like, we were not even CEOs. Christmas, Easter only. Like, we never stepped foot in a church. The only time the word God was ever mentioned with me growing up was when there was a curse word associated with it, and I just didn't know. Now, I knew there was a God, but like Jesus, I had no idea who that was. And if I ever heard the Holy Spirit, I'm like, that's spooky stuff. So I mean, I grew up absolutely ignorant of God, other than knowing that there was a God. And of course, our first image, our first perception of God is usually from our earthly father. And because that's the design that God created, for our dads to mirror his love for him, and then our dads to show that love to us. So all I knew of God was what I saw of my dad, was that he was big, he was intimidating, that he was distant, and that all he was waiting to do was smack me if I messed up. And I learned the best way to stay protected was to avoid both of them.
So was there, I know, like in my life, and not getting that affirmation, so that played out in crazy ways as I became an adult,
Yeah.
and this wound of abandonment and everything that I was dealing with. But my thing is, I was good time Johnny. I
Yeah.
was the wild and crazy guy. The wilder and the crazier, the better, because then I was getting that attention that I didn't get from a father. And
Yeah.
so that's how it kind of played out, destructively in my life. Was How did that play out in your life and not getting the affirmation? Did you go search for it in something else, or what did that look like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're exact. Your own point. I mean, we do. We have that deep desire for love and security and significance and purpose, and I had none of that from my dad, from my family. So I did. I sought it out. I mean, you know, I was 11-year-old joyriding in other people's cars after midnight, and I was 14, 15 years old, sitting in bar rooms, until the next day when I went to school. And where it really pushed me to find affirmation, John, was, when I was 12 years old, I was sexually abused by a female teacher, and then as I grew older, actually that relationship continued from 12 years old until I left for college. And some people, they're like, "Oh man, you're a guy, man, you're a kid having sex with this woman, like, bro." I'm like, "No, man, you don't understand the damage that it's done to my life." And what I found out as I got older was this teacher was a serial sexual predator. So it wasn't because I was special. It was every year she picked someone in the class and groomed them. And then most of them she continued a relationship with until it just petered itself out. But I was the perfect victim because I was the guy looking for affirmation. Because I mean, this predators know that, they sense that, they can detect that in your spirit, your behavior. I mean, just a simple, hey, that's a good job on that spelling test. Really, and that's where I know. I mean, I know that's where she was able to pick up on that deficiency in my spirit. And so, what led me was this whole relationship and all my puberty formative years was thinking of love as being secretive and taboo, and something that you've got to hide, because that's what she really rooted in my spirit, was that, look, I love you, but don't tell anybody about it. So to me, love and intimacy was a secret. It was something dark that was to be protected. And of course, every relationship in most of my young life was like that. And I think back, John, it's like, I mean, any girl that I dated in high school or college, like, obviously none of them worked out, and they were never going to work out because I was always playing from behind the eight ball. Because number one, I didn't have the affirmation. I'm not talking blowing smoke when you're a kid. It's just like, hey, good job. I mean, just stop telling your kids you want a backhand, and tell them how bad they are. But I needed that affirmation, that desire sent me into a predator's arms at what it did. And then, of course, she was able to manipulate that for years. And look, I wasn't running from it. Of course, I was 12 when it started, but I was getting it in one place and I wasn't getting it anywhere else. And I was getting it, unfortunately, in the arms of a sexual predator. And she did. She filled what I thought was that need. And then, of course, what I realized was I was left empty. I was left drained. And then I was left with the soul scars of not even during those formative years of puberty and teenage, how to have a regular, healthy interpersonal relationship with a woman. And of course, then to me, relationships are always based on physical sex. And that became a big part of my life, was always physical sex. And in there, I found affirmation and what I felt was love. And it wasn't until God saved me, and it's like, hey, let me show you what love looks like. And then that's what saved my life. I mean, it really did, because up to that point, it was chaos, and it was just constant suicide ideation. And look, I'm not a dumb person. I mean, I knew I wasn't doing right, but I didn't know how to stop doing wrong. And
And, and I can only imagine too, dude, because I've heard stories similar years before,
mhm,
and they are rare. And well, I think in perspective of everything, it's usually
right.
a young female getting
Oh,
sexually
sure.
abused, right? Versus, and I'm sure it happens more than what we realize. What you're
Right.
similar to your story, but just the confusion of a
Hmm.
young man, especially in your circumstances, where you're looking at the affirmation from a father, not getting it, So then this woman's giving you, but then the confusion of the sex, and then you don't want to go to admit to anybody because what, a man doesn't do that, and just the pride. I
Right.
mean, all the false masculine junk that goes along the emotional piece of
Yeah.
not wanting to go tell somebody about the abuse because you're a man.
Right. And you're right. I mean, I think the cultural more is that it's not sexual abuse, right? I mean, you'll see these articles on social media where a high school teacher, she gets busted for having sex with her students, and you read the comments, and it's like, bro, that's the luckiest dude. That dude's a stud. That dude. And I'm like, listen, when you're a 12-year-old boy, when you're a 13-year-old boy, I mean, your body and your mind and your spirit, it's just not meant for that. And it's right, so you're right. What do? You don't see yourself as a victim because culture says, hey man, we're men, we're supposed to conquer in the bed. And I mean, of course God says, hey, you can conquer it, but just do it in the marriage bed with your wife. And then I mean, you talk about the complexity of those emotions that go with that. I mean, you're getting satisfied for the first time in your life, right? You're finally feeling like you're not a piece of dirt. You finally feel like somebody thinks you're worth something. And that's beautiful that you think, right? Because now you got this hole that you feel like there's water being poured into, but at the same time you're going through these physical reactions that your body's just not ready to experience. And then on top of that, you're putting, hey, but keep it quiet because our love is special, and so then now it's turning you away from your family and authority figures. Because what? Because the one person who says they love you is telling you, if you tell, they're going to take me away. Man, you want to talk about guilt and pressure? Man, that's a lot of stuff going on for a 12 and 13-year-old kid. So then you look at that, and then now you're going to tell me, oh, that kid's a stud. Now that kid's in for some serious damage.
Well, and two, just the view of sex. I think you kind of alluded to it. It's then just the view of sex when you do finally meet and you're in a place, age wise, maturity wise, and everything else, but not processing all of this stuff, all of
Mm-hmm.
your junk, right, to a place of healing and wholeness. I can see how even just that view of sex, now, how does that play out in your adult life? I mean, it's
Right.
like, wow, because again, you said it was secretive, and it's almost kind of like, no, but yet it's what God's created, right? It's
Yeah.
amazing, something God created for all of us when done in the midst of a marriage
Right.
and couples. But to just, how did that distort your view? Can you unpack that a little bit more as far as how it distorted your view as you got older?
Yeah, well, I mean, every relationship that I had, and I mean, there were some, fantastic women that I had met, but again, like I said, I was always playing from behind the eight ball, because what instead of just enjoying just a healthy relationship, my only foundational basis of being an intimate relationship was rooted in secrecy, was rooted in darkness. Because like I said, it started at 12, and it didn't end until I went out of state to go to college. And so that really a launch pad into, I mean, all you know is what you know. So that's when I walked off, when I went off to college, and the next relationship I'm in, well, all I know is secrecy. All I know is, well, it's really nobody's business. And then of course, then that breeds suspicion on whoever you're dating. And so it wasn't successful. It didn't pan out very well.
Well, and you mentioned this too, and what's interesting is we interviewed Tom Lane, who's a pastor at Gateway, and he did this
Yeah.
great piece about normal. What is normal? And
Hmm.
how everybody's normal is different,
Right.
And he said, man, so many times I've had couples, young couples in my office, and we've been doing counseling, and I turned to the young man and said, tell me your story. Oh, grew up, good life, pretty normal. Mom and dad got divorced. Dad moved down the street, pretty much never saw him again. He
Hmm.
just kind of goes, wow, hold on a second. That's not normal. Let me tell you what's normal. And let me say what the
Yeah.
Bible, let's talk about what the Bible says is
Right.
normal. But it is that distorted, and that I'm sure as a kid, maybe deep down you knew something. But
Mhm.
how did that play out in your life, even with your father? Did you think that kind of just most people had a dad similar to yours, or what did that look like?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, all you know is what you know. And I thought, my dad was the greatest dad on earth. And I figured every dad was like that. So, and we couldn't complain. I mean, who are you going to complain to? I mean, really, my family, when my grandparents came over from Italy and then settled in Philadelphia, and then my dad came down south to play college football. Now, this is in the late 40s and 50s. And then we settled in South Louisiana, and we had no family other than our immediate family, no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents. We had nothing, just our parents and that. So there was really no outlet, you know. And then, of course, so it's like, well, why would you complain, or who would you complain to? Because you think this is the way it is. Like everybody's dad is like that. But look, I'll tell you, to a big degree, a lot of us grow up in that dominated lifestyle, in homes dominated by one parent or the other. And more often than not, it's the dad, but but we do. I mean, look, I do. I mentor a lot of men after I retired from my career, and same thing, like you said, a lot of them have the same story. And it was really my wife, as I continue, as we got to know each other, and even still, and you start sharing childhood memories, and yeah, I left the ballroom at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and it was all I could do to get to class by 7 o'clock. And my wife was like, "You were in a ballroom until 6 in the. When did you get there?" Well, after football practice the day before. And she's like, "Scott, that's not normal." Or I would tell her about fighting and just violence and just growing up in this, and she's like, "That's not normal." My wife had a normal childhood, and most of the people she knew had normal lives. But when you grow up in an environment like that, and of course, the birds of a feather. I mean, you're running around with other violent people. I mean, I'm not a 14, 15-year-old sitting in a ballroom by myself. I'm sitting in there with a couple other, teenagers and young people, and of course the whole gambit of range. But I mean, to me, that was my life, because everybody in my circle ran in that circle. I wasn't the only kid taking people's cars after midnight on school. There was a whole bunch of us riding around. I wasn't fighting by myself. So you grow up and you think everybody's like this. Now, I mean, there was always that, like you said, that tug that, like, something ain't right. Like I would have labeled myself a good kid. I was smart. I made good grades. I played all the sports. I was respectful to adults. And I think that was maybe my way of kind of absolving what I knew I was doing wrong. It doesn't make it right, but I think to just that level of consciousness about what you were doing wasn't right.
Isn't it interesting too, even as men, and even though we don't want to admit it so much, but growing up, you not getting words of affirmation, I was not having a dad, so longing for those words of affirmation, something in my marriage that I've struggled with for years. And my wife, anytime she was critical of me, I'd get angry,
Oh
right?
yeah,
I'd get ticked, like, because I was already feeling the unworthiness and the shame and all the
yeah,
mess that came along with being abandoned.
yeah,
And so it's taken us several years to really walk through and get better with one another in that. How
yeah,
did that play out with you in your adult life and in your marriage?
yeah. No, that's a good point. And I was just the opposite, because if there ever was any emotional upheaval, it was squashed. I mean, growing up, right, in my household, I mean, uh, my childhood house, there was no conversation. I mean, if there was disagreement, it was one way, and that was his way, or the highway. And I mean, my oldest brother, he left home when he was 17 years old, and I mean, this was back in the early 60s, and I didn't see him for 30 years. Because of that, because there was only one way to live. And back then, you're talking early 60s, and like, even for men to grow their hair a little long. And I mean, I remember as a child going down the hall, listening to my mom and sisters on the telephone, just crying and crying, and like begging my brother, like, just cut it to the collar. And then they would run to my dad. Hey, someone's, he said he would. That's not enough. That's not enough. I mean, like, so there was never a modeling for positive communicate, like resolution communication, right? I mean, there was a conflict, and there was only one way to do it. And so and if you disagree, there was absolute suppression, or there was discipline. There was physical punishment or pain that went with it. So when I grew up, And in my marriage was when there was a conflict, I shut down. Like I didn't argue. I did nothing. I didn't yell. I mean, I just shut down. And, so, well, that's probably the best thing to do. It's not the best thing to do. Nothing gets resolved in silence. But again, all you know is what you know. And all I knew was a life of you keep your mouth shut. I don't want to hear what you got to say. And so I learned just that, you just shut your mouth. And so when my wife and I disagreed, that's all I knew. And of course, here she is. She's like, Scott, let's talk about this. Let's resolve. You know, and I didn't have the skill set because I never had the model, the example of how two healthy adults are supposed to resolve conflict.
Dude, and I think there's so much to that. I remember my dad in the I was 11 when he died, but I remember him saying kids are to be seen and not heard.
Yeah.
I mean, who says that?
Well, you're lucky because we weren't even to be seen. Look, they would wake us up like on weekends in the summer. And I'm talking, we lived in the cane fields, we had the cane fields, we had the railroad track, and we had a bayou. And look, they would wake us up at sunrise and like, get out. I mean, we're little kids. And like, we get on our bikes and we get out and we come back, probably before we passed out from hunger and had lunch. And then of course the old thing, come back when the streetlights came on. But yeah, so you're lucky. At least you got to be seen.
Oh, that's true. Well, and I think to your point too, and it's an interesting conversation about, because me and my wife have talked about this in arguments in front of our kids and seeing them watch us fight well. You know what I mean?
That's a good point. That's good. Yeah.
And not arguing, screaming, yelling, but having arguments or having discussions, if you will, serious discussions in front of them to see, and then being able to hug and say, hey, I'm sorry, darling, or whatever, right? And for them to watch that, because you just said it, not having seen that modeled, it's like all you knew was to shut down because that's all you ever see your old man do, right?
Right. And, and that's right. I mean, Leah and I are very purposeful on, right. There's discretion on the disagreements, and that we have, but it's important for our kids to see that, and that we do disagree and that we do resolve because, I mean, look, one of the big things was I never saw my parents argue, never. So I grew up thinking, well, if you love somebody, you don't argue. Well, the first time we got in an argument, I'm like, this is the wrong woman. I married the wrong woman, because if she was the right woman, well, she wouldn't be talking back or we wouldn't be arguing, because my parents stayed married until my mom passed away. So, but that's unrealistic. But again, that's the theme, I guess, of the show is, right, is all you know is what you know. So it is important to let your kids see that as adults, there's going to be healthy disagreements, and that you're going to fight clean. You're going to fight fair. And by fight, I mean, like you said, just this healthy debate conversation until the point of resolution, or even and to the point of reconciliation. You may not always even agree, but your kids need to see that as well.
Now, so let's talk about, I know you, in dealing with, for example, some of the issues, again, as an adult with the upbringing and everything that you've had to go through, depression. Talk about how that kind of came to play in your life and how what God's shown you as a result of that.
Yeah. I remember it's so clear. It was my 18th birthday. I was 18 years old, and it was Christmas Eve, and I'm standing outside with one of my brother-in-laws. And of course, everything involved alcohol. We drank for every holiday, everything involved alcohol. And I don't know if I'd ever experienced depression, or if it never was, I was aware of it. Maybe it was just always this oppressed feeling of sadness, melancholy. But I remember it was Christmas Eve. I was 18 years old, and it sunk on my spirit. And I'm like, all right, well, what do I need to do? I'm going to the bar, and I thought I was going to drink more. But it was a feeling that never left me. And then that depression really drove me to despair, because, then what I started to do was I started like, well, through achievement and accomplishment, I can beat this back, right? I can make myself feel better about myself. So, through academics, I always had to be the highest achiever. I got a bachelor's degree, then I got a master's degree, then I got a PhD. And look, I'll tell you, when I got that PhD, and I mean, I'm thinking, well, that's the tip of the spear. I mean, I should feel fantastic about myself. As I'm walking off the stage, my mind starts like, what's next? What's next? What's next? Because that depression started to come back because of the emptiness that was in my spirit. When I was, even in my career, I promoted up where I was the top position in my profession. I couldn't go any higher. I started like, well, maybe someplace bigger, maybe more people to supervise. And that depression drove my need to satiate that feeling of emptiness. And then the job that I had, I was law enforcement for almost 26 years. And then I was struggling with PTSD on top of that. And every day I mean, John, I would wake up, and I always kept a revolver, 357 in my nightstand. It wasn't a duty revolver. It was designated. And I just knew that one day I was going to wake up, and that was the weapon that I was going to use to end it. Because, as men, we look at ourselves, we're fixers and we're doers. And if we can't fix our own self, then what value are we as men? I'm not going to retool the process or admit that I need help. If I can't power through it and fix it myself, at some point, I'll just put an end to it. Spare everybody the pain and everybody the suffering, especially myself. And unfortunately, we look at it as almost noble, that we don't want to be a burden. If we can't lead at the tip of the spear, if we're the weakest link, we'll take the link out. And that's where, for me, like literally suicide ideation was almost a daily consideration. And because I would try to fill myself with accomplishment, with achievement, with affirmation or acclamation. And when I didn't get it, that depression, boom, it would bottom out. And it only got deeper, and it only got deeper.
So, and let me ask you this. I didn't think about this till you were talking, and being reminded of you being a policeman. There's so many that I've talked to and heard from pastors, and I can imagine the same thing in policemen. A lot of men become pastors or get into ministry because they had a rough life, right?
Yeah.
And there's this psychology behind it. Well, I'm going to help save others. I'm going to rescue others.
Yeah.
Because I know what it's like being abused and, et cetera.
Yeah.
Do you think that's what led you into law enforcement, or was that just something totally different?
No, look, I mean, I played cops and robbers when I was a kid, but I never had the dream to be a cop. Actually, my dad was a school teacher, and he was a high school football coach. That's what I wanted to do my whole life. That's all I wanted to do. And it was actually, I even wanted to go to the same college and play football that he did. And it was my senior year in high school. And I was being recruited and by the same college. And I'm like, my dream's coming true. All I wanted to do was please him. Performance-based love. And I wound up having my legs shattered, the tibia and fibia and a compound fracture. It was just horrible break. And I was ruined for football. I physically recovered, but not to the degree of being able to play D1 football. And then I went to college, and I didn't have a clue. I was just so lost, and partying, just like you said. The bigger the spectacle I made, the more attention I got, and the better I felt about myself. And then I would come home to Louisiana during the summers, and I would go to the gym. I was powerlifting and bodybuilding, and I met a guy in the gym, and we worked out the whole summer. Older, a little older than me. I mean, I was a young 20s, and he was probably mid 30s, and like the coolest guy ever, And at the end of the summer, before I'm leaving, I said, like, what do you do? He said, man, I'm a cop. I'm like, you mean like cops are like regular people? He goes,
Like
yeah.
good
And
people? Wow.
yeah, I mean, look, this is one of the coolest guys I've ever known. And that's a testament to how cool he was. Most of us men always say, well, what do you do for a living? What do you do we measure ourselves based on what we do and stuff like that. Like, I enjoyed the friendship with this guy so much, it never even came to pass, But when he said, oh, I'm a cop, I work for this agency, like, I'm like, man, this is the coolest guy, And then he kind of like, hey, if you're interested. So I went into law enforcement, but I know what drove me, And look, I was very successful. I mean, I worked for a large nationally accredited sheriff's office. I was at the highest levels of policy boards in Washington, D.C. I was a chief of police my last 5 years. But really what drove me, John, was that I hated being a victim as a child. And that drove me to I didn't want anybody else to be afraid. I didn't want anybody else to be hurt. I didn't want anybody else to live in fear. And that's really what drove my career. I mean, I was a SWAT commander for 16 years. I worked undercover for 12 years because I had to go after the worst people. The people that hurt people the most were the people that I wanted to get after. And that's really what drove my career. And it did, just because I hated being so afraid my whole life that I didn't want anybody else to ever feel that fear. And I mean, look, no, I was just,
Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I mean, again, it goes back to learning as a man who we are today, to not judge who we were back then by our abilities today. And look, I mean, look, as a child, I would stay in bed at night. I would pee in the bed because I was so scared to get out of that bed and walk through that house. And then of course, then there would be punishment for having pee in the bed. But that's no way to live. I mean, look, fear. I would lay up at night staring at the door, just scared to death that who was going to come in. And so to say that doesn't have an effect on your whole life. And of course, that's just, it drove me to be a good cop. And I was a good cop. I was good at what I did. And it wasn't because I hated the bad guys, because I've always had so much compassion for everybody. I mean, I understood that, with the flip of a coin, I could have been in their shoes, right? I could have been in that situation. But by the grace of God, I wasn't. And God gave me that opportunity to go and help the victims. But even the bad guys, I always, or I say bad, the criminals, I always had a sense of compassion for them, and just worried about them and prayed for them, and just really was always willing to help them if I could. But so it wasn't hatred for criminals that drove me, but it was my love for those victims, because I could empathize with it.
Tell me your story about how you came to know God.
Well, like I said, growing up, scared to death of him. Just some big, distant, scary dude. And then I went off to college. I went to college in Mississippi. It was in the Bible Belt. And, I started going to church, but I went wherever the good-looking girls went to church, and that's the services I went to. But I was hearing that word, and really all it was doing was confusing me, because I'm hearing about a God of love. I'm hearing about a God of restoration and salvation, second chances and mercy. And I'm like, that don't square with nothing I've ever known, because the only God I know is the God that my dad showed me. And he wasn't none of that stuff. And look, it took years, and it took years until I came to a point where, when I literally hit rock bottom, and there was nothing. And you know what? But God was there, and God was just, Scott, I love you. I love you. I love you. And I had to be convinced that it wasn't some trick, because all I'd ever known of God, all I'd ever known of the big man, the father in my life, was my dad. And there was never anything sincere about I love you or I care about you. But I accepted Christ into my life almost 30 years ago. And I mean, I was on fire. I was on fire for God. I mean, you imagine, here's this hard-shelled, rough, tough, tumbled, wounded, shattered, battered guy. And then all of a sudden he finds Jesus. And I was so on fire. And I thought, you know what? Man, I want to set my parents free. I want them to know the love of Christ like I know the love of Christ. I want them to be able to love people the way I love people. So, I mean, look, I'm about 2 weeks into the faith, and I go to their house and I start telling them about Jesus Christ, and I do nothing. I wouldn't quote scripture. I didn't even have a Bible, and I'm like, God loves you, and God. I was saved at a Southern Baptist church, and my mom looks at me, and she was a sweet woman, and she says, "That's a cult." And I look at my dad and my dad goes, "You're dead to me." I said, "All right," and I got up and I walked out of that house. And so you want to talk about an introduction to the faith. But then you learn as you mature, right? Because God says it's all about separating darkness from light, from the wheat from the chaff. And that was my introduction. But you know what it did? It hurt me. It hurt me at the time, but it released me from the shackles, from the captivity that my parents, particularly my dad, had over me. And it allowed me to walk in Christ. And because he was really all I had, and he was really all I needed. And then I guess backslid. I mean, because I'll tell you, I had no relationship. I was learning religion, but I wasn't engaged in relationship. Now I'm talking over the course of many years. And that was one of the things, my first experiences after I was saved. And now, I mean, we're talking about confusion. Okay. I mean, like, take one of us and throw us in a foreign country, right? Different language, different custom, different culture. That's receiving salvation. And I remember going back to my church, and boy, the old men in the church would be like, "How's it going, brother?" I was like, "It's going good." And I'd sit through church, and after church, I'd go, "What do I do now?" "Well, come on back next Sunday." I come back next Sunday. "How's it going, brother?" And I'd be like, "It's going good, I guess." This service, I'm like, "What do I do now?" "We'll come back next Sunday." Well, the problem, John, was from that come back next Sunday until "How's it going, brother?" I was struggling. I was struggling in my life. I mean, the pressure, the just drinking, partying, everything in my life, the depression. And I'm thinking, well, man, I accepted Christ. Like, things are supposed to be amazing, right? And all I'm getting is, "How's it going, brother?" and "Come back next Sunday." Like, if I had someone in my life to just say, "Hey, man, how's it going?" And I mean it, like look you in the eyes and say, "How's it going?" And just giving me 1 second beyond dismissing and saying, "Hey," to the next, look, I would have opened up. And I know that my faith walk would have been different in the early years. But then as I matured, but God, I never walked away. And that's really what kept me tethered throughout my whole career, was that I always had that foundation of faith. And then it was many years back that then I was just transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit and just set on fire. They talk about being called versus transformed. Like Peter was called, right? And I love Peter because Peter was a wild card. He was a knucklehead. I mean, he said things that Jesus should have just, bam, I'm going to smite you where you are.
You're out of the group.
Look, you're out, bro. You're out.
Yeah.
And but Peter loved him. But Peter was just he was uncouth, right? As all of them were. But Peter was called and Peter followed. But it wasn't until when we get to the book of Acts, when he received the power of the Holy Spirit, that he became transformed, that he became mature in his faith and confident in his faith. And he began to speak and walk in faith. And that's what had happened in my life, was that I was called and I followed, but it wasn't until bam, that I got transformed, that eventually that helped lead me to retire from my career and started men's ministry.
Dude, I love it. Tell people about your new book. I caught you in the middle of a drink there, didn't I?
I know, man. Well, I got a copy right here. So I am talking to my pastor, and we're visiting a church in our community. Our kids were so connected into this church, youth night, youth ministry. And Leah and I said, we better go check this place out, right? Let's just see what's going on. And so we walk in on a Sunday, and it was amazing. Spirit-filled, pastors praying, and he mentions he's from South Louisiana. And I'm like, oh, I like that guy. I mean, he's like me. We're South Louisiana. So after church, I went up and I introduced myself and my family. And I said, man, I'm from South Louisiana. So we connect. There's something about that Cajun culture. So, and he's like, well, how did you wind up here from Louisiana? And I gave him a thumbnail sketch of my life, right at retirement and then since retirement, about this, just walking through a wilderness season and just all this. And he goes, "Oh, obscurity." And I thought he was making fun of me. And number one, I didn't know what obscurity meant. And so I'm like, "Oh, a fancy church term, you know?" But he goes, "No, you went through the wilderness season, man." And we start talking about that's what I'd gone through. You know, I was a chief of police that was catered to by the city and everybody, and anything I wanted was mine. And you talk about filling up your affirmation. It was false affirmation, but you constantly have people coming to you, doing for you, needing things from you. I mean, that was such false affirmation. But you know what? God said, uh, "Hey, I want you to retire." I was 4 years away from a full 30-year pension. I just received a 4-year contract. I was walking out of there with 30 years, 100% of my salary, 100% of my insurance paid the rest of my life. And 4 years before that, God says, "Retire, because I got other work for you to do." And I was like, "No, no, God, you don't understand pension math. I mean, that's not heavenly." And he's like, "No, no, you don't understand submission." And 2 weeks later, I walked into my mayor's office and I gave my retirement papers and I walked away after almost 26 years. And I thought, "Oh my gosh, like God called me to serve. Like there's going to be some big stuff going on in my life because I'm a chief of police. I got a PhD. I'm a college professor, blah, blah." And John, there was nothing. For 3 months, for 6 months, for 9 months, a year later, look, I put on 70 pounds. Again, depression had visited me. But what I realized was God, like he did with everybody, had moved them into the wilderness season so they could break off the chains of who they used to be before they could serve and who he wants us to be. Because like a lot of men, my identity was grounded in what I did, not in whose I was. And I didn't even, at 50 years old, retirement, I didn't even realize when God said, "Scott, I want you." I didn't know who I was. I could tell you my academics, my athletics, my professional achievement, but I couldn't tell you who I was as a person. All I was a reflection of what I did. And when I walked away from that, man, look, God started to show me. But he had to break that old stuff off of me. So I share that with the pastor, and his story was he was a president of a Bible college. This guy was traveling the world, preaching 50, 60,000 people at a time, this dude was rocking it, right, for the kingdom. And God said, "I want you to plant a church in South Dallas." Well, he thought, "I'm planting the next mega church, right? I'm going to be the next TD Jakes. I'm going to be the next old Joel Osteen." And years later, he's still fighting to keep people from walking away. And then since in the time it's grown and matured. So in our common experiences, we began to realize that everybody goes through these wilderness seasons, and everybody looks at it as punishment. I mean, look, even Jesus on the cross, what did he cry out? "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And it's easy to think when you don't see God moving in your life that he's abandoned you. It's like, you called me out to do men's ministry and then you leave me alone? You pulled a fast one on me. So it's like, am I being punished? Have I misheard the call? Did somebody else do wrong that's causing me? But what it is God is doing a work in you before he can do a work through you. And that only gets done in the wilderness season. And that's what the book is about. It is really, we all go through these seasons. I mean, everybody. And the only way for God to prepare you for the next assignment, next season in your life, is to break off the old chains and build you up with a new ability, a new anointing. So really, I reached out to the Adam McCain, is my co-author and my pastor, and I said, "Hey, how about we write a book about obscurity?" And he's like, "That was my idea." We kind of laughed about that. And but for about 8 months we worked together. We meet regularly, and it was just an amazing experience. And it came out November the 3rd, and then actually at our home church, they're using it as a Bible study. So we also have the book, and we did a leader's guide and a study guide that walks you through, really unpacks the book. And I tell you, it's been so powerful to have people share. I mean, I have a man, we have a home church, a home group at our house, and we have a man, he's 89 years old, just great man of the faith. And he reads the book and he said, I spent 23 years in the wilderness season. And I mean, and look, he's in tears recounting. And of course, people's like, well, how long do I have to spend in the wilderness season? And I always say, well, it depends. It depends on your level of resistance. If you're resistant to the work that God's going to do in you, you'll be there for 23 years, right? Moses was there the first time for 40 years. It always freaks people out when we talk about Moses. Like, oh, yeah, he wandered the wilderness for 40 years. It's like, do you realize he'd already done a 40 years? Twice Moses was wandering the desert for 40 years, but not wastefulness. God was doing a work in him. So it's been a blessing for people to share their experiences with the book, how they've walked through wilderness, and now how they understand that God wasn't punishing them. They weren't bad people, that indeed God was readying them for the next promotion in their life. So it's been a joy. It's been a pleasure.
I love it. Tell people how they can connect with you and get the book.
Yeah, sure. Well, my website is scottsilverii.com, and I have a blog site, and I've written on that over the years, and just more of opinion pieces and really my walk in faith.
Now spell that out. Spell your last name.
It's the color silver with two I's, Silverii. So scottsilverii.com. And then my website and Facebook, it's Five Stones Church Online, and we have an active Facebook environment. And then really with the book is Amazon, iBooks, anywhere where books are sold. It's ebook, it's paperback, and it's hardcover. And then soon it'll be coming out in audiobook.
Love it. Love it, brother. Hey, dude, I appreciate you doing this, man. And you mentioned at the beginning that, you finally talked me into letting you come on the show, bro. I have been wanting to get together with you and hear your story in depth for a while now. And just now, with all this pandemic stuff, it's insane how lives are being turned upside down. You think this whole thing being home so much would free up a lot of your time, but it's like, man, now I find myself busier than
I know
was before in some cases. But anyway.
No, it's it's for us, like I think a lot of people, hope for a lot of men, that it's been a time to kind of reflect and start to prioritize. You and I talk often, and I'm blessed by the relationship with you. And we, a theme of that you and I talk about a lot is just prioritizing what's important in our life. And the more we talk and share, and really men need that other sword to sharpen, right?
Yep.
And you and I have that relationship. And in those conversations, I've learned, and I think is that this is not important, or this does not add value to my life, or this could be better. And I hope that men really do take this opportunity to really reflect in their life, to accept this attitude of gratitude. Because look, it's easy to sit back and say, oh, woe is me, this didn't go the way it was supposed to be. And, I think about people like that. Oh, remember like December and early January? It's like, it's 2020. It's a new vision. I see clearly now. I mean, I'm like, all right, the tick of that talk when it turned New Year's magically didn't mean life was going to be great. But for some reason, because the year happened to be 2020, we thought it's going to be amazing. Guess what? It can still be amazing. Did it go the way you wanted it? No. But look, I believe this year for me, the verse is Romans 8:28. It said, for those who love the Lord, he does all things for good. And it doesn't mean all things are good, but it means God will use things for good. So if you do, if as men, if we adopt this attitude of gratitude, look for the blessings in every day, look for the friendships, like friendships with you. Those are the blessings. Those are the things when this thing finally pans out that we're going to be able to look back and say, this was a great opportunity for me to improve the value of my life.
You know what, brother? And I appreciate those words. And I think there's so much truth, especially for men. This whole pandemic, I think, has been a fascinating study in people needing personal interaction.
Yeah.
And what happens if we don't get it, right? And especially with men, we're already messed up in the sense that we don't want to be open and honest with one another.
Right.
Most men don't.
No,
and
right.
so this even more so with the pandemic and everything, just the isolation and even the more addiction and pornography and drinking and drugs. It's a very, very important time for us, I think, as men
Yeah.
to be letting others know, man, it's okay not to be okay. It's
Yeah.
okay to be struggling. It's okay to be in that wilderness, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And but God's still there, and He's a trustworthy, loving, forgiving God.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean, look, right now it's make it what you need it to be. Right. I mean, if you want to be negative, you're going to have a horrible, miserable time. But, and I mentor so many men, and it's like, it's just first, you've got to adopt that attitude of gratitude. Number one, be grateful that you're alive. I mean, there's people that sure they die from the virus and they die from cancer, they die from car wrecks and alcoholism. But that's life. And sometimes life sucks. I mean, bad things happen to good people. But you know what? You're still here. You're still in the fight. So, you're right. We've got a choice. We can either sit by ourselves and we can woe is me, or we can drop that macho facade and knock the mask off our face that's kept us in pain and willingly open ourselves up to somebody else. I mean, like when you and I talk, you'll say like, "Hey, brother, how you doing?" And then you hesitate. And you may not even realize you do it, but you do it because you really want to know how I am doing. And I'm sure you do that with everybody you talk to. And that really gives me the space to say, well, John, because right off the bat, we're not going to just vomit out emotions or whatever. Us, men have got to think like, why is he asking me this? Is he up to something nefarious? Can I trust him? But I love the way you do that, and I've adopted that. Is how's it going? And then pause, and then you give men the space to process, understand that you're not trying to set them up, you're not making fun, you're not being trivial, that you care. And you know what? If we can start doing that, something simple as that, just pause after like, hey, how's it going? And then stop and give the other man a chance to assess whether or not you're being sincere. And us guys are good, right? We got a BS detector. And when our BS detector says he's a good dude, we'll open up. So we owe that to one another. I mean, we all have the opportunity to sharpen each other's sword, but we've got to be sincere about it. And then we've got to be willing to engage and follow through. So,
Preach,
we're
brother. I love
done.
it. I love it, man.